Montana Territory, 1887. Winter came early that year, blanketing the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains in pristine white that glittered like scattered diamonds under a cold November sun. Miles Brannigan pulled his buckskin duster tighter around his lean frame as he guided his chestnut gelding along the ridge overlooking Clearwater Valley. At 26, he had already lived enough for 2 lifetimes, fought in enough range wars, buried enough friends, and drifted across enough empty country to know one truth above all others. A man survived longer when he kept to himself. The wind cut sharp across the ridge, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of more snow. Miles adjusted his worn Stetson and surveyed the valley below, where a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney of the Zimmerman homestead. Old man Zimmerman had passed 3 months back, but word around Clearwater was that his daughter had come from back east to settle his affairs. Another tenderfoot Easterner who would likely flee at the first harsh winter, another example of why putting down roots in this wild country was a fool's errand. Frontier's got no patience for those who don't understand it, Miles murmured to his horse, Copper. The animal's ears flicked back in familiar response. And neither do I. Miles had grown up in mining camps and cattle towns across 3 territories, watching as his father chased dreams that turned to dust. By 15 he was alone, orphaned by his father's recklessness and his mother's subsequent broken heart. The lesson was clear: attachments were dangerous. Loneliness was merely the cost of survival. His ranch foreman job at the Diamond Cross was just that, a job. He took his pay, did his work with a quiet competence that earned respect, and kept his distance from the ranch hands' camaraderie. Let them call him standoffish. Let them whisper that he was cold. The man who stood alone couldn't be betrayed or abandoned. As Miles turned Copper down toward the trail that would take him back to the Diamond Cross, a flash of movement in the valley below caught his eye. He reined in, squinting against the late afternoon glare. A figure moved through the snow near the creek that bordered the Zimmerman place, a woman in a dark green dress, her head uncovered despite the cold, her hair a rich mahogany that caught the sun. Miles told himself to ride on. Old man Zimmerman's daughter was none of his concern, but something in the deliberate way she moved made him pause. She wasn't simply walking, she seemed to be searching for something, stopping occasionally to brush snow from fallen logs or peer into the skeletal branches of willow shrubs. Curiosity, that damnable trait he thought he'd stamped out years ago, made him guide Copper down the slope, keeping to the tree line. He told himself he was merely ensuring no outsider was trespassing on Diamond Cross land, which bordered the Zimmerman property. It was his job, after all. At the edge of the trees, Miles halted, watching as the woman knelt beside the half-frozen creek. She wore no gloves and her bare hands dipped into the icy water, scooping up something he couldn't see. Then she rose, cupping whatever she'd found, and walked to a small clearing where sunlight broke through the pines. The woman's face was turned away, but Miles could see her profile, delicate but strong, with high cheekbones and a determined set to her jaw. She looked young, perhaps 22 or 23, too young to be alone in this unforgiving country, too vulnerable. Then she did something strange. She opened her hands, letting a small cascade of snow fall from her palms, and as it fell her lips moved, whispering something Miles couldn't hear. A name, perhaps, for her expression was one of quiet reverence, of secret knowledge. Whatever name she spoke, it wasn't one Miles knew, and the intimacy of the moment made him feel suddenly like an intruder. He was about to retreat when Copper snorted, pawing at the ground. The woman's head snapped up, her gaze locking with Miles's across the distance. For a long moment, neither moved. Her eyes widened slightly, not in fear, but in something like recognition, though Miles was certain they had never met. He would have remembered eyes that shade of amber, bright as whiskey in sunlight. "Can I help you?" Her voice carried clearly across the snow, stronger than he expected, edged with a confidence that belied her solitary position. Miles straightened in his saddle. "Ma'am, didn't mean to startle you. I'm Miles Brannigan, foreman at the Diamond Cross." She studied him, her head tilting slightly. "Ah, my neighbors then," she gestured toward the creek. "Am I trespassing, Mr. Brannigan?" "No, ma'am," creaks the boundary line. "You're still on Zimmerman land." She nodded, seemingly satisfied. I'm Pearl Zimmerman. Harold Zimmerman was my father. Miles touched the brim of his hat. My condolences, Miss Zimmerman. Thank you. She glanced down at her hands, now reddened from the cold, then back at him with a directness that was uncommon in women he'd encountered. Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Brannigan? It's a cold day to be riding fence lines. The invitation caught him off guard. Every instinct told him to decline, to tip his hat and ride on, to maintain the careful distance he kept from everyone in Clearwater Valley. But something in the way she stood there, alone but unafraid, surrounded by wilderness yet seemingly at home in it, made him curious in a way he hadn't been in years. Much obliged, Miss Zimmerman, but I should be getting back to the ranch. The words came automatically, his defense against connection. She smiled then, a small upward curve of lips that transformed her face from merely pretty to something that made Miles's chest tighten unexpectedly. Another time, perhaps, she said, and turned toward the small cabin, leaving Miles with the unsettling feeling that she had seen right through him. As he rode back to the Diamond Cross, Miles found himself replaying the strange scene by the creek, the woman touching the snow, whispering a name, her complete lack of surprise at finding herself watched. Pearl Zimmerman was an enigma, and despite his better judgment, Miles Brannigan found himself wanting to solve her. 2 days later, a blizzard descended on Clearwater Valley with a fury that trapped the Diamond Cross hands in the bunkhouse, the cattle huddled in sheltered draws, and Miles pacing the ranch house like a caged wolf. As the wind howled and snow piled against the windows, his thoughts kept returning to the Zimmerman place. Was Pearl Zimmerman prepared for a Montana blizzard? Did she have enough firewood? Had someone warned her about keeping a rope line between cabin and barn? By the third morning, when the storm finally broke, leaving the world buried under 4 feet of snow, Miles had convinced himself his concern was merely neighborly duty. When the ranch owner, Jacob Thornton, suggested someone should check on the outlying homesteads, Miles volunteered quickly. Take supplies, Thornton said, his gray mustache crusted with frost as he helped Miles load a packhorse. That Zimmerman girl's from Boston or some such place, probably never seen a real winter. The ride to the Zimmerman place took twice as long as usual, with Copper having to break trail through deep snow. As the cabin came into view, Miles felt a surprising surge of relief at the sight of smoke rising steadily from the chimney. At least she hadn't frozen. He was halfway to the cabin when the door swung open and Pearl Zimmerman stepped out onto the porch, a rifle held casually but competently in her hands. She wore a heavy wool coat over what appeared to be men's trousers and boots, her mahogany hair braided and pinned up beneath a knit cap. "Mr. Brannigan," she called, lowering the rifle, "twice in 1 week. To what do I owe the honor?" Miles dismounted, leading both horses closer. "Checking on neighbors after the storm, Miss Zimmerman. Brought some supplies." He gestured to the packhorse. Pearl stepped down from the porch, sinking knee-deep in snow but moving with the same deliberate grace he'd noticed before. "That's very kind, though unnecessary," she smiled, softening her words. "I'm not quite as helpless as the good people of Clearwater seem to think." Up close, Miles could see her more clearly than he had by the creek. Her face was heart-shaped, with high cheekbones and a straight nose dusted with a few light freckles. But it was her eyes that held him, amber, yes, but with flecks of gold that seemed to catch and hold the winter light. She was, he realized with an unwelcome jolt, not simply pretty but truly beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with delicate features and everything to do with the intelligence and strength that radiated from her expression. "Most folks around here have seen city folk come west unprepared," Miles said, trying to maintain his professional demeanor. "Didn't mean any offense." "None taken," Pearl gestured toward the cabin. "But since you've come all this way, the least I can do is offer you that coffee I promised, and perhaps some breakfast. I've venison stew that's been simmering since dawn." The sensible thing would be to decline, to deliver the supplies and continue his rounds to the other homesteads. But the smell of the stew was already reaching him, rich and savory on the cold air, and the thought of sitting in a warm cabin rather than riding through more snow was suddenly appealing in a way it shouldn't have been. "I'd appreciate that, Miss Zimmerman." Inside the cabin, Miles was struck by the changes since old man Zimmerman's time. The main room was still sparsely furnished, but clean, with colorful woven blankets softening the rough-hewn furniture. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with more volumes than Miles had ever seen outside a schoolhouse. A delicate china teacup sat incongruously beside a stack of leather-bound journals on a small desk near the window. "You can hang your coat there," Pearl said, gesturing to pegs by the door as she placed her rifle in a rack. "And please call me Pearl. Miss Zimmerman makes me feel like I'm back teaching school in Boston." "You were a teacher?" Miles asked, removing his snow-crusted coat and hat. Pearl nodded, moving to the iron stove where a pot bubbled. "For 3 years, literature and natural sciences at a girls' preparatory academy." She ladled stew into 2 bowls, then poured coffee into tin cups. "Please sit." Miles settled at the small table, acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd shared a meal with anyone other than the ranch hands or his employer. "Hard to picture you leaving a teaching position in Boston for." He gestured vaguely at the cabin and the wilderness beyond its walls. Pearl's smile turned wistful as she set his food before him and took the seat across from him. "My father wrote me such wonderful letters about this place, about the mountains and forests, the wildlife, the changing seasons." She glanced toward the window, where sunlight sparkled on the snow-laden pine branches. "I felt I knew it before I ever arrived. And now that you're here, living it instead of reading about it." Miles couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. Pearl met his gaze directly. "It's more beautiful than I imagined." "And yes, more difficult." Her chin lifted slightly. "But I have no intention of leaving, Mr. Brannigan, if that's what you're asking." "Miles," he found himself saying, "if I'm calling you Pearl." She nodded, a small acknowledgement that felt oddly significant. They ate in silence for a few moments, the stew rich with herbs Miles couldn't identify. It was the best meal he'd had in months. "May I ask you something, Miles?" Pearl said finally, setting down her spoon. "You can ask." "Why were you watching me by the creek that day?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. "I was checking the boundary line," he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. Pearl raised an eyebrow, clearly not believing him. "And did you find what you were looking for?" "No," Miles admitted after a moment. "I was curious what you were doing, picking up snow, whispering to it." Pearl's expression softened, not to it, to him. "Him?" She rose, walking to the small desk where she picked up one of the leather journals. Opening it, she removed a small daguerreotype and handed it to Miles. The image showed a young man in a Union Army uniform, his face serious beneath a capey cap. "My brother Nathaniel," Pearl said quietly. "He died at Cold Harbor in '64. He was 19. Miles studied the image, feeling the weight of her loss. "I'm sorry." Pearl took back the daguerreotype, her fingers brushing his. He always wanted to see the West. The mountains, the big sky. She looked toward the window again. In his last letter, he wrote that if he survived the war, he was going to come out here, maybe visit our father. Her voice grew soft. "He never got the chance." Understanding dawned. "So you came instead." Pearl nodded, "Partly for my father, partly for myself, but yes, partly for Nathaniel too." She replaced the image in the journal. "When I touch the snow and say his name, it's like he gets to experience it through me somehow. It's foolish, I suppose." "No," Miles said quietly, "it's not foolish." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of shared understanding. Miles had lost too many people not to know the ways grief could shape a life, drive decisions, create rituals of remembrance. For the first time since arriving at the Zimmerman cabin, he felt the wall he maintained between himself and others waver, just slightly. Their conversation turned to practicalities. How Pearl had managed during the blizzard, what repairs the cabin needed before deeper winter set in, how she planned to sustain herself. Miles found himself impressed by her preparations and her clear-eyed assessment of the challenges ahead. She might be from Boston, but Pearl Zimmerman was no foolish tenderfoot. As he prepared to leave, loading the supplies onto her porch rather than taking them back, Pearl handed him a small package wrapped in cloth. "Sourdough bread," she explained. My father's starter is the one thing I managed to keep alive since arriving. Miles took the package, oddly touched by the simple gift. Thank you. Will I see you at the Founders' Day celebration in town next week? Pearl asked as he mounted Copper. I'm told it's quite the event. Miles hesitated. He usually avoided town gatherings, preferring to remain on the periphery of Clearwater's social life. But the thought of seeing Pearl again, away from the isolation of her cabin or his professional duties, was unexpectedly appealing. Perhaps, he said noncommittally. Pearl smiled as if she'd heard the unspoken yes beneath his caution. I'll look for you then. As Miles rode away, he found himself already anticipating the Founders' Day gathering in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in years. The realization was unsettling, a crack in the careful armor he'd built. Pearl Zimmerman was dangerous, not because she was fragile or needed saving, but because she seemed to see past his defenses with those amber eyes. Because she made him want to be seen. The Founders' Day celebration brought the scattered residents of Clearwater Valley together in the small town's meeting hall, transformed for the occasion with pine boughs, red ribbons, and hundreds of candles that cast a warm glow over the proceedings. Miles arrived late, having spent too much time deciding whether to come at all, then too much time brushing his best shirt and polishing his boots once he'd made up his mind. He stood at the back of the hall, watching the townspeople laugh and dance to the music of a fiddle and accordion. Children darted between groups of adults, their faces sticky with candy, while matrons presided over tables laden with food. It was a scene Miles usually observed from a distance, present but separate, like watching a play he had no part in. Then he saw her. Pearl stood near the punch bowl, engaged in conversation with the schoolteacher, Mrs. Abbott. She wore a dress of deep blue that caught the candlelight, her hair styled in an elegant twist that exposed the graceful line of her neck. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, her eyes finding his across the crowded room. A smile bloomed on her face, genuine and welcoming, and Miles felt something in his chest tighten at the sight. Before he could decide whether to approach her, the mayor's booming voice called for attention as he announced the start of the traditional Founders' Day dance. Miles began edging toward the door, his usual escape route when social obligations threatened, but he wasn't quick enough. Mr. Brannigan, Pearl's voice reached him just as he put his hand on the door latch. He turned to find her standing a few feet away, her cheeks flushed from either the warmth of the room or her quick movement through the crowd. "You came," she said, her smile making it sound like a personal victory. For a short while, Miles qualified, his hand still on the door. Pearl tilted her head, studying him with that direct gaze that seemed to cut through pretense. "Were you leaving without saying hello?" "I'm not one for dances, Miss Zimmerman." "Pearl," she corrected gently, "and neither am I particularly, but I've been told it's a matter of civic pride to participate in at least one." She held out her hand, a challenge in her eyes. "Would you do me the honor, Miles? Just one dance, and then you can escape back to your solitude if you wish." He should refuse. He knew how to dance. His mother had insisted on that much civilization, but he'd avoided it for years, preferring not to invite the contact or conversation it required. Yet Pearl stood before him, hand extended, eyes warm with something that wasn't quite teasing but wasn't entirely serious either, and Miles found himself taking her hand before he could think better of it. "One dance," he agreed, surprising himself as much as the onlookers who raised eyebrows at the sight of the Diamond Cross's reticent foreman leading Harold Zimmerman's daughter to the dance floor. The music shifted to a waltz, and Miles placed his hand at Pearl's waist, keeping a respectable distance between them as they began to move with the other couples. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder, warm through the fabric of his shirt. "You dance well," Pearl observed after a moment. "Not what one expects from a man who avoids town gatherings." "My mother's influence," Miles said, guiding her through a turn. She believed a gentleman should know how to dance, even if he lived in mining camps most of his life. Pearl's expression softened. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. The past tense hung between them, and Miles was surprised to find he didn't mind Pearl knowing this small piece of his history. She made sure I could read Shakespeare and calculate sums as well as track deer and break horses. A well-rounded education. Pearl's eyes held his, curious but not prying. How long has she been gone? 11 years this spring. Miles hadn't spoken of his mother in so long that the words felt strange in his mouth. Fever took her. After my father died in a mine collapse, she just lost the will to keep fighting, I think. Pearl's hand tightened slightly on his. I'm sorry, Miles. It was a long time ago. He guided her through another turn, surprised at how easily they moved together. What about your mother? She died when I was born, Pearl said. I never knew her except through my father's stories. She was an artist, painted botanicals for scientific journals. That's how they met. He was cataloging plant species in Massachusetts. Your father was a scientist. Miles couldn't reconcile the image of old man Zimmerman, taciturn, practical, known for his hunting skills, with Pearl's description. A botanist before he came west. Pearl's smile was fond. He never stopped being one, really. Those journals you saw in my cabin, full of his observations of local flora, detailed drawings, notes on growing seasons and medicinal uses. Miles thought of the bookshelves lining Pearl's cabin wall, the careful organization of the space, her mention of teaching natural sciences. You take after him. In some ways, Pearl acknowledged, though he would say I inherited my mother's stubborn streak. The music drew to a close, and couples around them began to separate, but Miles found himself reluctant to release Pearl's hand. She made no move to step away either, her amber eyes still holding his. Thank you for the dance, Miles, she said softly. My pleasure. The words weren't merely politeness, he realized. It had been a pleasure, one he hadn't expected or sought but couldn't regret. Before he could say more, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. 3 men entered, trail-worn, rough-looking, with the hard eyes of those who lived outside the law. Miles recognized them immediately. The Blackwell brothers, notorious for cattle rustling and worse across 3 territories. The oldest, Ray Blackwell, scanned the room with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing prey. His eyes paused on Pearl, a slow, appreciative look that made Miles instinctively step closer to her, his hand moving to the small of her back. Trouble, he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. Pearl tensed but didn't appear frightened. Who are they? Blackwell's bad news. Miles began guiding Pearl toward the side of the room, away from the newcomer's direct line of sight. They've been rustling cattle across the territory for years. Word is they're wanted for murder in Wyoming now, too. The mayor approached the Blackwells with visible apprehension, his earlier jovial demeanor replaced by nervous caution. Gentlemen, welcome to our Founders' Day celebration. What brings you to Clearwater? Ray Blackwell smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Just passing through, Mayor. Thought we'd join the festivities. That a problem? No, of course not, the mayor said quickly. Everyone's welcome, there's food and drink. And pretty ladies, the youngest Blackwell interjected, his gaze roaming the room until it landed on Pearl. He nudged his brother, nodding in her direction. Miles felt Pearl stiffen beside him, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Perhaps it's time I headed home. I'll take you, Miles said immediately. These aren't men you want to encounter on a dark road alone. They edged toward the back exit, but not quickly enough. Ray Blackwell's voice carried across the now hushed room. Well now, who's the fine-looking lady trying to slip away? Don't leave on our account, darlin'. Pearl ignored him, continuing toward the door with Miles close beside her. They had almost reached it when the middle Blackwell brother stepped into their path. My brother's talking to you, ma'am, he said, his tone making the honorific sound like an insult. Rude to walk away. Miles moved slightly forward, positioning himself between Pearl and the Blackwell brother. The lady's leaving, step aside. Recognition dawned in the man's eyes. You're the Diamond Cross foreman, Brannigan, right? His smile turned ugly. Here you run a tight operation. Too tight for any cattle to go missing, they say. That's right, Miles confirmed, keeping his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. Shame if something were to happen to change that. The threat was unmistakable. Miles felt rather than saw Pearl move to stand beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I'm Pearl Zimmerman. My father was the county magistrate before his passing, and I've inherited not only his property but his extensive correspondence with the territorial marshal." This was a fabrication. Old man Zimmerman had been a respected hunter and trapper, but never a magistrate, yet Pearl delivered it with such conviction that Miles saw doubt flicker in the Blackwell brothers' eyes. "The marshal and I exchanged letters just last week," Pearl continued smoothly. "He's quite interested in certain activities along the Wyoming border. I expect him to visit Clearwater before the month is out." It was a masterful bluff. The Blackwell brother glanced back at Ray, who had been watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. "Something wrong, Lem?" Ray called. Lem hesitated, then stepped aside. "Nothing wrong, lady was just leaving." "And missing all the fun." "That's a shame." Ray started toward them, but the sheriff of Clearwater, who had been notably absent until now, finally entered the hall, 2 deputies behind him. "Blackwell," the sheriff acknowledged tersely. "Heard you were in town." The dynamic in the room shifted immediately. The Blackwells might intimidate townspeople, but open conflict with the law wasn't in their interest, not when they were outnumbered and surrounded by witnesses. Ray Blackwell smiled thinly. "Just being neighborly, Sheriff. No law against that." "No, there isn't," the sheriff agreed, "long as you keep it that way." Ray tipped his hat with mocking deference, then turned his attention back to Pearl. "Another time, perhaps, Miss Zimmerman. I'll look forward to making your better acquaintance." The threat in his words was clear, and Miles felt a cold fury settle in his chest. But Pearl merely nodded coolly and took Miles's arm. "Good evening, gentlemen." Outside, the night air was crisp and clean after the stuffy warmth of the meeting hall. Stars blazed overhead, illuminating the snowy street where Pearl's horse and buggy waited alongside Miles's copper. "That was quick thinking," Miles said as he helped her into the buggy, "about your father being magistrate." Pearl adjusted her shawl against the cold. "I've found that men like that often back down when confronted with authority they're not certain about." She glanced toward the hall. "But I don't think we've seen the last of them." Miles untied her horse, handing her the reins. "I'll ride with you to your place." "That's not necessary, it's out of your way." It wasn't a suggestion, Pearl. Miles's tone left no room for argument. "Those men don't make idle threats, and Ray Blackwell has a particular reputation when it comes to women who stand up to him." Pearl studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, but you'll stay for coffee when we arrive. The night is cold, and it's a long ride back to the Diamond Cross." As they traveled the moonlit road to Pearl's cabin, Miles found himself acutely aware of the isolation surrounding them. The dark pines, the empty expanses of snow, the distance to the nearest neighbor. For the first time in years, the isolation felt like a liability rather than a comfort. Pearl had handled herself admirably in town, but out here, if the Blackwells decided to pay her a visit, she would be dangerously vulnerable. Pearl seemed to sense his thoughts. "I'm not defenseless, Miles," she said as they approached her cabin. "My father taught me to shoot before he taught me to read, and I keep his rifle clean and ready." "The Blackwells don't come alone," Miles replied grimly. "And they don't fight fair." They reached the cabin, and Miles insisted on checking the surrounding area and the small barn before he was satisfied they were alone. Inside, as Pearl lit lamps and stoked the fire, the space felt different than it had during his last visit, smaller, more vulnerable to the vast darkness pressing against its walls. Pearl moved about with the same quiet competence he'd noticed before, putting coffee on to boil, setting out cups, the domesticity of her actions at odds with the tension of the night's events. When she finally sat across from him at the small table, her eyes were troubled despite her composed expression. "Tell me honestly, Miles, how concerned should I be about the Blackwells?" Miles considered softening the truth, then decided against it. Pearl deserved candor. "Very. They've been growing bolder over the past year. Started with cattle rustling, moved on to holding up stagecoaches. Now there are rumors about a rancher's wife in Wyoming who resisted when they came to steal horses. He met Pearl's gaze directly. They left her husband to find what was left of her. Pearl's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. I see, and you think they might target me specifically now. Ray Blackwell doesn't like being challenged, especially by a woman. And you made them look foolish in front of the whole town. Miles leaned forward, his forearms on the table. You should consider staying in town for a while, at least until the marshal really does come through. Pearl shook her head firmly. This is my home now. I won't be driven from it by men like that. Pearl, would you leave the Diamond Cross if they threatened you? She challenged. That's different. I'm a man. Pearl's eyes flashed. More capable, better with a gun. Not alone, Miles finished quietly. The words hung between them and Pearl's expression softened. Neither am I, she said after a moment. Not anymore. I have neighbors now. The community in town, she hesitated. I have you. The simple statement hit Miles with unexpected force. When was the last time anyone had claimed him, included him, counted him as someone they had in their life? Years, certainly. Perhaps not since his mother died. Yes, he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. You do have me. Pearl reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand in a touch so light it might have been accidental, except for the deliberate way her eyes held his. Then I'll be fine. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, until Miles reluctantly pulled back and rose from the table. I should go. It's late, and I have an early start tomorrow. Pearl nodded, walking him to the door. Thank you for the dance, Miles, and for the escort home. Lock this behind me, he instructed, stepping onto the porch, and keep that rifle close tonight. Pearl smiled, a small, private expression that made his heart beat faster. I will. Good night, Miles. As he rode back to the Diamond Cross through the cold, star-filled night, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The wall he'd built around himself, his protection against attachment and loss, had developed cracks that might not be repairable. And strangest of all, he wasn't certain he wanted to repair them. Over the next 2 weeks, Miles found reasons to ride by the Zimmerman place almost daily, checking fence lines, tracking strays, surveying for winter grazing. Each time Pearl would invite him in for coffee or a meal, and each time he stayed a little longer. They talked about books she was reading, the history of the valley, his experiences on cattle drives. She told him about her life in Boston, the girls she had taught, her dreams of perhaps starting a small school in Clearwater someday. With each visit, Miles found it harder to maintain the distance he had cultivated for so long. Pearl listened when he spoke, really listened, her amber eyes intent on his face. She challenged his more cynical views, laughed at his dry observations, and shared her own thoughts with a candor that was refreshing after years of guarded interactions. Meanwhile, rumors circulated about the Blackwells. They had been seen at a ranch 30 miles north, had rustled cattle from a spread near the territorial line, had been drinking heavily in a saloon 2 towns over. The sheriff organized extra patrols, and ranchers kept closer watch on their herds. The Diamond Cross owner, Thornton, doubled the night guards and warned all hands to be vigilant. On a clear December afternoon, Miles rode to Pearl's cabin with a purpose beyond his now customary visit. He had spent the previous evening crafting a small wooden box from cedar, carving a simple pattern of mountain wildflowers on its lid. Inside, he had placed a packet of seeds, alpine columbine, a beautiful blue flower native to the high country, which Pearl had mentioned wanting to add to the garden she planned for spring. As he approached the cabin, he saw Pearl outside, chopping wood with the same determined efficiency she brought to all tasks. She paused, pushing a strand of mahogany hair from her forehead, then noticed his approach. Her smile of greeting made his chest tighten with an emotion he was becoming increasingly unwilling to deny. "Miles," she called, setting down the axe. "Just in time to avoid work, I see." He dismounted, returning her smile. "Looks like you're managing fine without my help. I won't refuse an extra pair of hands if you're offering." Pearl brushed wood chips from her apron, an incongruously domestic garment over the practical men's trousers she wore for outdoor work. "But first, come inside. I've made apple cake." The cabin was warm and fragrant with cinnamon and baking apples. Miles removed his hat and coat, acutely aware of how comfortable he had become in this space, how much he looked forward to these moments of domestic tranquility. "I brought you something," he said as Pearl cut thick slices of cake and poured coffee. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "Did you?" Miles placed the wooden box on the table between them. "It's not much." Pearl set down the coffee pot and took the box, her fingers tracing the carved design with appreciation. "You made this?" "Yes." Miles felt unaccountably nervous as she opened it. When she saw the seed packet, her face lit with genuine delight. "Columbine, oh Miles, they're perfect." She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Thank you, this is the most thoughtful gift." "You mentioned wanting them for your garden," he said, pleased by her reaction. "They grow wild up near Blacktail Ridge. I thought you might like to have some closer to home." Pearl carefully set the box on the table and rounded it to where Miles stood. Before he realized her intent, she rose on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek, her hand resting lightly on his arm for balance. "Thank you," she said again, her face close to his, close enough that he could see the individual flecks of gold in her amber eyes. Miles hadn't planned to kiss her. He had told himself repeatedly on the ride over that his interest in Pearl Zimmerman was neighborly, perhaps friendly, but nothing more. That he wasn't capable of offering more, didn't want to offer more. That the path of least pain led away from entanglement, not toward it. But when her lips touched his cheek and her eyes met his with warmth and something deeper, something that mirrored the feeling growing in his own chest, all those sensible thoughts scattered like leaves in a high wind. He leaned down, closing the small distance between them, and kissed her. Her lips were soft and tasted faintly of cinnamon, and when her hand moved from his arm to his shoulder, drawing him closer, Miles felt something within him break open, a wall crumbling, a defense falling away. The kiss deepened, and Pearl responded with a fervor that matched his own, her body pressing close, her hand at the nape of his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Miles rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to move away completely. "I didn't come here intending to do that," he said softly. Pearl's smile was radiant. "I'm glad you did anyway." He should step back, Miles thought. He should apologize, make some excuse, and leave before this went any further. Before he risked more of himself than he could afford to lose. Before he gave Pearl reason to believe he could offer something lasting when his entire adult life had been structured around avoiding exactly that. Instead, he kissed her again, more gently this time, cupping her face in his hands as if she were something infinitely precious. And in that moment, he acknowledged to himself that she was. The afternoon passed in a haze of sweetness, shared cake and coffee, more kisses, conversation that flowed easily but was now punctuated by lingering looks and casual touches that felt anything but casual. As the winter light began to fade, Miles knew he should return to the Diamond Cross, yet found himself reluctant to leave the warmth of Pearl's cabin and presence. "I'll come back tomorrow," he promised as he finally donned his coat and hat. "There's a storm brewing, according to the old-timers at the ranch. I want to make sure you're prepared." Pearl walked him to the door, her hand in his. "I've weathered storms before, Miles. Not like the ones that blow through this valley in December." He squeezed her hand. "Just humor me." She reached up to straighten his collar, a domestic gesture that felt both foreign and right. "I will, on one condition." "Which is?" "That you admit this isn't just about neighborly concern anymore." Her eyes held his, serious despite her small smile. "That you admit there's something more between us." Miles had spent so many years avoiding emotional honesty that the words didn't come easily. But Pearl deserved truth, not evasion. "There is," he admitted, "something more, something I wasn't looking for, and frankly, something that scares the hell out of me." Pearl's smile widened. "Good. Being scared means you're alive, Miles Brannigan. Being scared means you're not just surviving anymore, you're living." She kissed him once more, a promise and a challenge, and Miles rode back to the Diamond Cross with his heart lighter than it had been in years, despite the snow clouds gathering on the horizon. The storm Pearl and Miles had discussed arrived the next day with a vengeance that surprised even the old-timers. It wasn't just snow, but a true blizzard that turned the world white and impenetrable, with winds that howled like lost souls and temperatures that plummeted well below zero. The Diamond Cross hands stayed close to the ranch buildings, venturing out only to check on the nearest cattle and to keep the paths to the barn clear. Miles paced the ranch house like a caged wolf, staring out at the whiteout conditions and thinking of Pearl, alone in her cabin. He had intended to ride to her place that morning, but Thornton had forbidden anyone from leaving the immediate ranch area, declaring it suicide to attempt the drifted trails. "She's a capable woman," Thornton reassured him, having noticed Miles's distraction. "And she has shelter, firewood, she'll ride it out fine." Miles nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He knew Pearl was capable. He also knew that capability had its limits against Montana's savage winter storms. What if her firewood ran out? What if the roof of her small barn collapsed under the snow's weight, injuring or killing her horse? What if? The what-ifs multiplied with each hour the storm raged. By the second day, with no sign of the blizzard abating, Miles had made up his mind. He would go to Pearl's cabin as soon as there was enough visibility to navigate, regardless of Thornton's orders or the risk. But on the morning of the third day, as the storm finally began to weaken, a ranch hand burst into the main house, his face grave beneath its coating of ice and snow. "Riders coming in," he reported, 3 of them armed. Miles grabbed his rifle and followed Thornton to the porch. Through the still falling snow, 3 mounted figures approached, their horses struggling through drifts. Even at a distance, Miles recognized them, the Blackwells. "What in hell are they doing out in this?" Thornton muttered. "No one travels in a blizzard." A cold dread settled in Miles's stomach. "Unless they're using it as cover." Thornton shot him a sharp look. Cover for what? Miles didn't answer, his mind racing ahead to the implications. The Blackwells were notorious opportunists. They would know the storm had isolated homesteads and ranches, known that help would be slow in coming if they struck. And they had a particular score to settle with Pearl Zimmerman. The riders drew closer, and now Miles could see that they carried something bulky wrapped in a tarp, tied across the back of one horse. "That's cattle," Thornton said, squinting through the snow. "Rustled beef." Miles wasn't so certain. The shape didn't look right for a butchered steer, and the Blackwells weren't the type to struggle through a blizzard just for a side of beef. Not unless they had another reason to be out in the storm. As the riders reached the yard, Miles stepped forward, rifle ready but not yet aimed. "That's far enough," he called. Ray Blackwell reined in, snow crusting his beard and coat. "Now is that any way to greet travelers in distress, Brannigan?" he shouted over the wind. "We're half frozen and looking for shelter." "Plenty of shelter in town," Miles replied coldly. "It's that way." He gestured with his rifle. Ray smiled, an expression devoid of warmth. "Town's too far in this weather. We need to warm up, feed our horses." He patted the tarp-covered bundle. "Got some fresh meat to share too. Just harvested it from that Zimmerman place." Miles felt his blood run cold. "What did you say?" "Found a nice fat deer grazing near the Zimmerman cabin," Ray said, his eyes fixed on Miles's face, reading his reaction. "Shame about the place, though. Roof collapsed under all this snow. Hope that Boston lady made it out." His smile widened. "Or maybe she's buried under it. Hard to tell in a storm like this." It was a lie, Miles told himself. A deliberate provocation. Pearl's cabin was sturdily built, the roof recently repaired by her father before his death. It wouldn't collapse from snow, and the shape under the tarp was too small for a deer, unless it wasn't a deer at all. Miles raised his rifle, aiming directly at Ray Blackwell's chest. "Open that tarp." Ray's hand moved toward his gun. "Now that's not friendly." A shot cracked through the howling wind, and Ray's hand jerked away from his holster. Blood bloomed on his sleeve. "The next one goes through your heart," Miles said, his voice deadly calm despite the rage and fear building inside him. "Open the tarp." Lem Blackwell, his own gun now drawn, snarled, "You're making a mistake, Brannigan." "Miles," Thornton's voice held warning. "Don't do anything rash." But Miles's focus was absolute, his rifle unwavering. "Last chance, Blackwell. Show me what's under that tarp or I start shooting for real." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ray nodded to his youngest brother, who reluctantly untied the bundle and pulled back the tarp. Instead of Pearl's body, as Miles had feared, the bloody carcass of a young buck was revealed, partially butchered. "See," Ray said, his voice mocking, "just like I said, fresh venison." His eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "You seem mighty concerned about that Zimmerman woman, Brannigan. Didn't realize you had a personal interest." Relief made Miles light-headed, but he kept his rifle steady. "Ride on, Blackwell. The Diamond Cross isn't offering shelter to rustlers and murderers." "In this storm." "That's practically murder itself," Lem protested. "Should have thought of that before you decided to ride out in it," Thornton interjected, his own rifle now raised, "and before you threatened one of our neighbors. Now move along or face the consequences." The standoff held for several more tense seconds before Ray Blackwell spat into the snow and turned his horse. "We won't forget this," he called over his shoulder as the brothers rode away, quickly disappearing into the curtain of white. The moment they were out of sight, Miles turned to Thornton. "I need to check on Pearl." Thornton looked like he wanted to argue but instead nodded grimly. "Take Hank with you." "And extra ammunition." The ride to Pearl's cabin was arduous, with Copper struggling through snowdrifts that sometimes reached his chest. Hank, a taciturn ranch hand who had worked at the Diamond Cross for years, followed silently, understanding the urgency without needing explanation. As they approached the clearing where the cabin stood, Miles felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The roof was intact to his immense relief, but there was no smoke rising from the chimney, no light in the windows despite the early winter darkness. "Pearl," he shouted, dismounting and wading through the snow to the porch. No answer came. The door was closed but unlocked, swinging open at his touch. Inside, the cabin was freezing, the fire long dead. A chair lay overturned near the table, and Pearl's rifle was missing from its rack. Signs of a struggle were evident, a broken cup on the floor, the small desk knocked askew, her father's journals scattered. "Pearl," Miles called again, moving quickly to check the small bedroom. Empty. Hank appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Tracks out back, 3 horses, and smaller prints that could be a woman's boots." He hesitated. "Some blood in the snow, too." Miles felt the world narrow to a single, terrible focus. "The Blackwells have her." "Looks that way," Hank agreed soberly. "Trail leads east, toward the old mining camp in the foothills." Of course, the abandoned mining camp would provide shelter from the storm, several intact cabins, a stable for horses, and most importantly, isolation. No one would look for the Blackwells there, not until the weather cleared enough for proper tracking. By then, Miles refused to complete the thought. How long ago? Hank considered the disturbed snow, the cold cabin. "Given the fire's out completely, I'd say at least 12 hours, maybe more." Which meant the Blackwells had taken Pearl before they arrived at the Diamond Cross. Their appearance there had been deliberate, a taunt, a way to see Miles's reaction, to confirm his connection to Pearl before they. What ransomed her, killed her, used her in ways that made Miles's blood boil just contemplating. "We're going after them," Miles said, already moving toward the door. Hank grabbed his arm. "Hold on, Brannigan, it's nearly dark." "Storm's still blowing. We'd be riding blind and they know it. That's why they showed themselves at the ranch. They're confident we can't follow until the weather breaks." Miles yanked his arm free. "I'm not waiting." "And getting yourself killed won't help the woman," Hank countered firmly. "Think man. We need more men, supplies, a plan. We go back to the ranch, gather what we need, and set out at first light when we can actually see the trail." Miles wanted to argue, but Hank's logic was sound. Charging off alone into a blizzard at dusk would likely result in his death by exposure, not in Pearl's rescue, and she needed him alive. "First light," he agreed reluctantly. Not a minute later. The night was the longest of Miles's life. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could only pace and plan and pray that Pearl was still alive, that the Blackwells hadn't already done their worst. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, he had assembled a group of 6 men, himself, Hank, 3 other ranch hands and Thornton himself, who refused to be left behind. "The Blackwells have been a menace to this valley long enough," the older man declared, checking the action on his Winchester. "Time someone put an end to it." They rode out as the first gray light filtered through breaking clouds. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crystalline world of white that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. The Blackwells' trail was partially obscured by fresh snow, but still visible enough to follow 3 horses, moving east toward the mountains. Miles rode point, his focus absolute, his mind filled with images of Pearl. Her smile as she accepted his gift, her boldness at the Founders' Day celebration, the warmth of her lips against his. The thought that he might never see her alive again was unbearable, a physical pain in his chest that made it hard to breathe. The trail led, as Hank had predicted, toward the abandoned mining camp nestled in a sheltered valley among the foothills. As they approached, Miles signaled for the group to dismount and proceed on foot, using the cover of pine trees to mask their approach. The camp consisted of several log cabins arranged around what had once been a central clearing, now buried in snow. Smoke rose from the chimney of the largest cabin, and 3 horses were visible in the Linta stable attached to a smaller structure. "They're here," Miles whispered, studying the layout. "No sign of movement outside." Thornton nodded grimly. "Could be sleeping after their night ride, or waiting for better weather to move on." "Or keeping watch," Hank added. "Don't underestimate them. They're snakes, but they're not stupid." Miles considered their options. A frontal assault would put Pearl at immediate risk. The Blackwells would use her as a shield or worse. But surrounding the cabin might allow them to negotiate, too. His planning was interrupted by a scream from inside the main cabin, a woman's voice, high with pain or terror. Pearl's voice, all caution forgotten, Miles surged forward, rifle ready. "Pearl." A shot rang out from the cabin, the bullet splintering a tree trunk inches from Miles's head. "Stay back, Brannigan," Ray Blackwell's voice carried across the clearing. "Unless you want the woman to suffer more than she already has." Miles froze, his heart hammering. Behind him, Thornton and the others spread out, taking cover behind trees and the remains of mining equipment. "Let her go, Blackwell," Miles shouted. "This is between you and me." A harsh laugh answered him. "Is it? Seems to me it's between me and this pretty Boston lady who thought she could make a fool of me in front of the whole town." A pause. "She's not so high and mighty now, are you, darlin'?" Another sound followed, the unmistakable crack of a hand striking flesh, then Pearl's voice, strained but defiant. "Go to hell, Blackwell." Pride and fear warred in Miles's chest. Pearl was alive, still fighting, still herself. But for how long? "What do you want, Blackwell?" Miles called, playing for time while signaling to Hank to circle around behind the cabin. "Now there's a question," Ray replied. "Originally, I just wanted to teach this woman some manners. But seeing how you came charging out here with half the Diamond Cross crew, I'm thinking she means something to you. Something worth paying for." "Name your price," Miles said immediately. "Miles, no," Pearl's voice followed by the sound of another blow. $5,000, Ray called. "Cash by tomorrow noon. You bring it alone and maybe the lady goes home intact." More or less. It was an impossible sum, more money than Miles could hope to gather even if he had weeks to do it. But that didn't matter now. The demand was just a delay tactic, a way for the Blackwells to maintain control while they decided how to escape this standoff. "I'll need proof she's unharmed," Miles countered. A moment later, Pearl was shoved through the cabin door onto the porch, Ray Blackwell's gun pressed to her temple. Miles's breath caught at the sight of her face bruised, a cut on her lip leaving a trail of dried blood down her chin, her dress torn at the shoulder. But her eyes, when they met his across the clearing, were clear and fierce, full of the same courage he had admired from the first. "Satisfied?" Ray asked, his arm around Pearl's waist, pulling her against him possessively. Miles nodded, his mind racing. He could see now that Lem stood at the cabin's side window, rifle ready, while the youngest brother was presumably guarding the rear. 3 targets, 1 hostage, and limited angles of attack. "I'll bring the money," Miles said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Just don't hurt her further." Ray smirked, "Too late for that request, Brannigan. But I'll try to leave enough of her for you to recognize." He started pulling Pearl back into the cabin. "Wait," Miles called desperately. "Let me speak to her, just for a moment." Ray paused, considering. 1 minute. "Then you ride out and get my money." He shoved Pearl forward slightly, keeping the gun trained on her. Pearl stood straight despite her injuries, her eyes never leaving Miles's face. In them he saw not just fear but determination and something else. A message, a warning perhaps. "Are you all right?" Miles asked, taking a step forward, then stopping when Ray tightened his grip on Pearl. "Yes," Pearl said, her voice stronger than he expected. "Miles, you shouldn't have come." "Not for me." "I'd always come for you," Miles replied, the truth of it resonating in his chest. "Always." Pearl's eyes softened momentarily, then hardened with resolve. "My brother wouldn't want you to sacrifice yourself. Remember what I told you about Nathaniel." The apparent non sequitur confused Miles for a second before understanding dawned. Pearl was telling him something important, something about her cabin, about the day by the creek. "I remember," he said carefully, "about Cold Harbor." Pearl nodded slightly, relief flickering in her eyes. She had gotten her message across, though Miles wasn't entirely sure what it meant yet. "Time's up," Ray growled, yanking Pearl back. "Get moving, Brannigan. 5,000 by noon tomorrow, or you'll find pieces of your woman scattered across the valley." As Ray dragged Pearl back into the cabin, she met Miles's eyes one last time, her lips forming words he couldn't quite catch before the door slammed shut. Miles retreated to where Thornton and the others waited among the trees. "We need a plan," he said grimly. "One that doesn't involve waiting until tomorrow or leaving Pearl in their hands a minute longer than necessary." Thornton nodded. "Agreed, but they've got the tactical advantage with her as hostage." "Maybe not," Miles said, thinking hard about Pearl's cryptic reference to her brother. "She was trying to tell me something. About Cold Harbor, her brother died there in the war. She mentioned him the day we met, when I saw her by the creek touching the snow." He frowned, trying to piece together the significance. "She said she came west partly for him, to experience what he never could." "What does that have to do with our current situation?" one of the ranch hands asked skeptically. "I'm not sure yet," Miles admitted, "but Pearl's smart. She wouldn't mention it without reason." He closed his eyes, trying to recall every detail of their conversations about her brother. "She showed me a daguerreotype of him. He was in uniform. Union Army." Hank, who had circled back from his reconnaissance, joined the discussion. 3 of them inside, 1 at each window and the girl tied to a chair in the center of the room. Hard to get a clear shot without risking her. Miles barely heard him, still focused on Pearl's message. Cold Harbor had been a brutal battle, he knew that much. Thousands of Union soldiers killed or wounded in a frontal assault that failed catastrophically. "A frontal assault, we need a distraction," Miles said suddenly. "Something to draw at least one of them out of the cabin, and we need it from the opposite direction." Thornton caught on quickly. "A feint from the rear, while the main force attacks from the front. Basic military strategy." "Exactly," Miles nodded. "But we need something significant enough to divide their attention without being so threatening they harm Pearl immediately." The men fell silent, considering options, when Miles remembered something else. The small barn where the Blackwells had stabled their horses. Fire was too dangerous with Pearl inside the cabin, but if they could stampede the horses. "Hank, you're the best with horses," Miles said. "Can you spook their mounts enough to create a commotion but not so much they run off completely?" Hank grinned slowly. "I reckon I can manage that." Miles outlined his plan quickly. Hank would create a distraction at the barn, hopefully drawing at least 1 Blackwell outside. Meanwhile, Thornton and 2 hands would approach from the front, demanding surrender. The remaining hand would circle to the rear window, ready to take a shot if opportunity presented. And Miles would use the chaos to enter through the side window, his focus solely on reaching Pearl. "It's risky," Thornton warned. "A lot could go wrong." "Everything's already wrong as long as Pearl's in their hands," Miles replied grimly. "I'm open to better ideas, but we're running out of time." No one offered an alternative. With terse nods, the men separated to take their positions, each understanding that the next few minutes would determine not just Pearl's fate, but possibly their own as well. Miles crouched in the snow beside the cabin, waiting for Hank's signal. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady on his rifle, his mind clear despite the fear churning in his gut. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he would reach Pearl. He would save her or die trying. The simplicity of this truth calmed him, focused him, burned away the doubt and hesitation that had characterized so much of his life. A sudden commotion erupted from the direction of the barn, horses whinnying in alarm, the crash of wood, Hank's voice shouting as if in panic. Inside the cabin, voices raised in alarm. "The horses!" the youngest Blackwell cried. "Someone's stealing the horses." "Go check," Ray ordered. "Lem, watch the front." Footsteps pounded across the cabin floor and the rear door slammed open. Miles tensed, counting silently. 3, 2, 1. From the front of the cabin, Thornton's voice boomed. "Blackwell, you're surrounded. Release the woman and surrender." A shot rang out, Lem firing from the front window. Return fire from Thornton's position cracked through the air. Miles used the chaos to move, darting to the side window where he had seen Lem stationed earlier. As expected, the window was now unguarded, Lem having moved to the front to return Thornton's fire. Miles smashed the glass with his rifle butt, clearing the frame before vaulting through. He landed in a crouch, rifle ready, and took in the scene in one sweeping glance. Pearl was indeed tied to a chair in the center of the room, her wrists bound behind her, her ankles secured to the chair legs. Lem Blackwell had his back to Miles, firing through the front window. And Ray Blackwell, momentarily distracted by the multiple threats, was turning from the rear window where he'd been watching his younger brother. Miles fired without hesitation, his bullet catching Lem in the shoulder, spinning him away from the window with a howl of pain. Ray whirled, his gun coming up, but Miles was already moving, diving toward Pearl as Ray's shot splintered the floorboards where he had stood a second before. "Miles," Pearl cried, her voice equal parts warning and relief. Miles rolled, came up on one knee, and fired again. His shot went wide as Ray ducked behind an overturned table. Outside, the gunfight continued, shouts, the crack of rifles, the youngest Blackwell cursing as he apparently discovered the trap at the barn. "Drop it, Brannigan," Ray snarled, his gun now aimed not at Miles but at Pearl's head. "Or she dies right now." Miles froze, his rifle half raised, caught in an impossible position. If he fired and missed, Pearl would die instantly. If he surrendered, they both would likely die once the Blackwells regained control of the situation. Pearl's eyes met his across the room, and in them he saw not fear but absolute conviction. She gave the slightest nod, an encouragement, a permission. In that moment, Miles understood what she was about to do, and his heart nearly stopped. "Last chance, Brannigan," Ray growled. Pearl's chair suddenly tipped backward as she threw her weight against her bonds, falling to the floor with a crash that momentarily distracted Ray. It was all the opening Miles needed. He fired twice in rapid succession, both shots finding their mark in Ray Blackwell's chest. The outlaw staggered backward, a look of disbelief on his face, his gun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling before he collapsed. Miles was at Pearl's side in an instant, cutting her bonds with his hunting knife, his hands gentle as he helped her to her feet. "Are you hurt, did they?" "No," Pearl interrupted, understanding his unspoken fear. "They roughed me up, but nothing worse." She swayed slightly, and Miles steadied her, pulling her against his chest. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her hair, the terror of the past hours finally catching up to him. "When I found your cabin empty." Pearl's arms tightened around him. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "I left as many signs as I could." From outside, Thornton's voice called, "Brannigan, status." Clear, Miles shouted back. Ray and Lem are down, Pearl's safe. A cheer went up from the men outside, followed by Hank's voice announcing that they'd captured the youngest Blackwell trying to flee on foot. As Thornton and the others entered the cabin, securing the wounded Lem and confirming Ray's death, Miles kept Pearl close, unwilling to let her go even for a moment. Her face was bruised, her lips swollen, but her eyes were clear and steady on his, filled with the same courage and determination he had come to admire and love. The word rose in his mind with crystalline clarity. Love. He loved Pearl Zimmerman with a depth and certainty that should have terrified him, but instead felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Later, after Pearl had been examined by Thornton, who had some medical experience from his army days, and pronounced battered but not seriously injured, after the surviving Blackwells had been secured for transport to the county jail, after hot coffee had been brewed and plans made for the return journey, Miles found a moment alone with Pearl. They stood outside the cabin, watching the late afternoon sun turn the snow-covered peaks to gold and rose. Pearl leaned against Miles's side, his arm around her waist supporting her still unsteady frame. "How did you know what I was trying to tell you?" she asked, with the mention of Nathaniel and Cold Harbor. Miles smiled slightly. "I didn't exactly, but I remembered you saying he died in a frontal assault there. It made me think about military tactics, about needing a different approach." He looked down at her, his expression sobering. "It was a long shot." "But it worked," Pearl said, her hand finding his. "You came for me. You found me." "I'll always find you, Pearl." The words emerged with a conviction Miles had never felt about anything in his life. "Wherever you are, whatever it takes." Pearl turned to face him fully, her amber eyes serious despite her smile. "Is that a promise, Miles Brannigan?" Miles knew what she was really asking, not just about rescue, about protection, but about permanence, about a future, about overcoming the isolation and self-sufficiency that had defined his life for so long. In the past, such a question would have sent him retreating behind his carefully constructed walls. But those walls had been crumbling since the day he saw Pearl touch the snow and whisper her brother's name, since she challenged him to dance at the Founders' Day celebration, since she kissed him in her cabin over apple cake and coffee. Now, looking into her eyes, Miles found he didn't want the walls anymore, didn't need them. The safety they had provided was an illusion compared to the reality of loving and being loved by Pearl Zimmerman. "It's more than a promise," he said softly. "It's a certainty. I love you, Pearl. I think I started falling the day I saw you by the creek, though I was too stubborn to admit it then." He took both her hands in his. "I've spent my life keeping people at a distance, convinced that was the only way to survive. But you showed me that surviving isn't living. That walls don't protect you, they just keep out everything worth having." Pearl's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "I love you too, Miles. Enough to follow you anywhere, or to make a home with you here in this valley. Enough to face down outlaws and blizzards and whatever else the frontier throws at us, as long as we face it together." Miles drew her gently into his arms, mindful of her bruises, and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion he'd kept locked away for so long. When they finally parted, the setting sun bathed them in golden light, turning Pearl's mahogany hair to flame and warming Miles's face in a way that felt like benediction. "Together," he agreed, the word both a vow and a liberation. By the following spring, Miles and Pearl were married in a simple ceremony in Clearwater's small church. The valley had turned green again, the harshness of winter giving way to the renewal of life that seemed, to both of them, a reflection of their own journey from isolation to connection, from survival to joy. Miles had left his position at the Diamond Cross to join Pearl on her homestead, expanding the cabin, adding proper stables and a workshop, planning for a future that included children and growth and community. Pearl had started a small school in town, teaching 3 days a week, bringing her love of literature and science to the frontier children who might otherwise have had little formal education. And on clear days, when the mountains stood sharp against the sky and the world seemed full of possibility, they would sometimes walk together to the creek where Miles had first seen Pearl touch the snow and whisper her brother's name. There beside the running water they would remember Pearl's brother, Miles's parents, the people they had loved and lost who had shaped their paths and ultimately led them to each other. "Nathaniel would have liked you," Pearl said one such afternoon, as they sat on a fallen log beside the creek, watching spring runoff tumble over stones still edged with patches of lingering snow. Miles smiled, his arm around her shoulders. Would he approve of his sister marrying a rough cowboy? Pearl leaned against him, her hand finding his. He would approve of me marrying a man who risked everything to save me. A man who learned that the walls we build to protect ourselves can become our prisons. She looked up at him, her amber eyes warm with love. A man brave enough to let those walls fall. Miles kissed her, still marveling at the simple joy of being able to do so whenever he wished, at the miracle of Pearl's love and the life they were building together. The frontier remained as challenging and sometimes dangerous as ever, but it no longer seemed like a place where a man had to stand alone to survive. Instead, it had become the setting for a greater adventure than Miles had ever imagined possible, the adventure of loving and being loved, of creating a home not just of logs and nails, but of shared dreams and mutual trust. As they walked back toward their cabin, hand in hand in the golden afternoon light, Miles glanced at his wife's profile and felt a surge of gratitude for the day he had paused on that ridge, for the curiosity that had drawn him down to watch a woman touch snow and whisper a name he did not know. That moment had cracked the foundation of his solitary existence, allowing something new and precious to take root. And in that growing, in that sharing, in that loving, Miles Brannigan had finally found his true home.